Across the Mediterranean world, the physical remains of the Roman Empire continue to define landscapes, cities, and historical inquiry. Roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and temples stand as enduring evidence of a civilization whose engineering and administrative systems reshaped vast territories. Yet among these achievements lie structures that do not fully conform to expectations. Some resist clear interpretation. Others appear to serve purposes that are only partially understood. These ruins, preserved through time yet stripped of context, continue to challenge archaeologists and historians alike. The study of Roman ruins has long depended on a combination of material evidence, literary sources, and comparative analysis. In many cases, inscriptions or written accounts provide clarity regarding a structure's purpose. However, when such records are absent or incomplete, interpretation must rely on physical clues, architectural form, location, construction technique, and associated artifacts. Even with these tools, certain sites remain ambiguous, inviting debate rather than consensus. In the hills surrounding Rome, in distant provinces once governed from the imperial center, and even beneath modern cities, there exist structures whose original functions are still contested. These sites are not mysterious in the sense of being unknowable, but rather in that the available evidence allows for multiple plausible interpretations. They occupy a space between certainty and speculation, where academic caution is essential. One such structure is the so-called Temple of Minerva Medica in Rome. Despite its name, scholars agree that it was not a temple dedicated to the goddess Minerva, nor is there firm evidence linking it to medical practices. The name itself is a product of Renaissance-era misidentification. What survives today is a large decagonal structure dating to the 4th century CE, featuring a domed roof and expansive interior space. Archaeological evidence suggests that this building was part of the Horti Liciniani, an imperial garden complex. Its architectural design, particularly the presence of large windows and a central dome, has led some scholars to propose that it functioned as an emphaeum, a monumental fountain or decorative water feature. Others have suggested it may have served as a reception hall or pavilion within the gardens. The absence of definitive inscriptions leaves its precise role uncertain, and its unusual design does not align neatly with more clearly identified Roman building types. Further south, near Naples, lies another enigmatic structure known as the Piscina Mirabilis. This vast underground cistern, constructed in the 1st century BCE, is among the largest of its kind in the Roman world. It was designed to store fresh water for the Roman fleet stationed at nearby Misenum. The structure itself is well understood in terms of its engineering and function. However, certain aspects of its design continue to raise questions. The interior of the cistern is supported by a grid of massive pillars, creating a space that resembles a subterranean cathedral. The scale and symmetry of the structure suggest not only practical considerations but also an attention to aesthetic form. Some historians have noted that the architectural grandeur exceeds what might be expected for a purely utilitarian facility. While this does not imply an alternative function, it highlights the Roman tendency to integrate visual order and monumentality even into infrastructure. In central Italy, near the town of Bomarzo, the remains of a large polygonal wall known as the Pyramid of Bomarzo have drawn attention for their unusual form. Carved directly into a massive block of volcanic rock, the structure features a series of steps and platforms leading upward. Its origin is not definitively Roman. Some scholars suggest it may predate Roman expansion in the region, possibly linked to Etruscan culture. However, its continued use or adaptation during the Roman period remains a subject of investigation. The purpose of the structure is unclear. It may have served a ritual function, possibly related to local religious practices. The lack of associated artifacts or inscriptions makes it difficult to confirm. The site illustrates how Roman-era landscapes often incorporated earlier cultural elements, complicating efforts to assign clear chronological or functional labels. Moving further east, in the Roman province of Syria, the site of Casa ibn Wardan presents another case of architectural ambiguity. Built in the 6th century CE during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, the complex includes a palace, a church, and a barracks. While its general layout is understood, the purpose of its location remains debated. Situated in a remote area far from major urban centers, Qaza ibn Wardan appears to have served both military and administrative functions. Some historians argue that it was part of a broader effort to secure the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire against Persian incursions. Others suggest it may have been intended as a regional administrative hub or a symbol of imperial presence in a sparsely populated area. The architectural style of the complex, which combines Roman building techniques with local influences, reflects the transitional nature of the period. Yet the limited documentary evidence leaves open questions about how the site was used on a day-to-day basis and why it was established in such an isolated location. In North Africa, the ruins of Timgad, a Roman colonial town in present-day Algeria, are often cited as an example of urban planning. The city's grid layout, public buildings, and infrastructure are well preserved. However, within this otherwise orderly environment lies a structure known as the Capitolium Annex, whose purpose is not entirely clear. Located adjacent to the main Capitolium temple, this annex features a series of rooms and corridors that do not correspond to typical temple functions. Some scholars have proposed that it may have served as an administrative space, possibly related to civic governance or financial management. Others suggest it could have had a ceremonial role, perhaps linked to rituals not fully documented in surviving texts. The ambiguity arises from the lack of inscriptions or definitive architectural markers. While the building's proximity to the Capitolium suggests a connection to religious or civic life, its internal layout does not provide a clear indication of its specific use. Back in Italy, beneath the city of Rome itself, the subterranean layers reveal another category of unexplained structures. Among these are the so-called cryptoporticus corridors, covered passageways that run beneath larger buildings or connect different parts of a complex. While many cryptoportici are understood as practical features providing shade or structural support, some examples exhibit characteristics that are more difficult to interpret. In certain cases, these underground corridors are unusually elaborate, featuring decorative elements and complex layouts that suggest uses beyond simple transit or storage. Some historians have proposed that they may have been used for private movement within elite residences, allowing occupants to navigate their properties discreetly. Others suggest they may have had ceremonial or symbolic functions, possibly related to ritual practices. The interpretation of these spaces is complicated by their context. Often discovered in fragmented form and lacking associated artifacts, they resist straightforward classification. Their presence underscores the layered complexity of Roman architecture, where practical and symbolic elements often coexist. Across these examples, a pattern emerges. The Roman world was not uniform in its architectural expression. Regional variation, adaptation to local conditions, and the integration of earlier cultural elements all contributed to a diverse built environment. In this context, it is perhaps not surprising that some structures do not fit neatly into established categories. Archaeological interpretation is inherently provisional. As new evidence emerges, previously accepted conclusions may be revised. In the case of these unexplained ruins, the challenge lies not in the absence of data, but in the complexity of the data that exists. Each structure must be considered within its specific historical, geographical, and cultural context. The enduring interest in these sites reflects a broader aspect of historical inquiry. The past is not a fixed narrative, but a field of investigation shaped by evidence, interpretation, and debate. The ruins of the Roman world, both understood and unexplained, continue to offer insight into a civilization whose influence remains deeply embedded in the modern landscape. As excavation techniques advance and interdisciplinary approaches expand, it is possible that some of these questions will find more definitive answers. Until then, these structures remain as points of inquiry, silent yet significant, inviting careful study and measured interpretation. Beyond the Italian peninsula, the reach of Roman authority extended into regions where local traditions, environmental conditions, and imperial ambitions intersected in complex ways. In these provinces, architecture often reflected a synthesis of Roman design principles with regional influences. This blending, while enriching the archaeological record, has also introduced layers of ambiguity when interpreting certain structures whose functions are not fully understood. In the eastern Mediterranean, the site of Baalbek stands as one of the most monumental expressions of Roman construction. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek is widely recognized for its massive stone blocks, some weighing over 800 tons, incorporated into its podium. While the temple itself is well documented as a center of worship, the engineering methods used to transport and position these enormous stones remain a subject of ongoing investigation. Archaeological evidence confirms the use of Roman lifting and transport technologies, including cranes, rollers, and labor forces. However, the precise techniques employed to handle stones of such scale are still debated. Some scholars argue that incremental lifting methods combined with earthen ramps were sufficient. Others suggest more complex logistical systems may have been involved. The question is not whether the Romans were capable of such feats, but rather how exactly these capabilities were executed in this specific context. Nearby, in the same complex, lies the so-called trilithon, a set of 3 massive stones forming part of the temple's foundation. Their placement suggests a high degree of planning and coordination. Yet no written records describe the construction process, leaving historians to rely on comparative analysis and experimental archaeology. The absence of definitive documentation ensures that interpretations remain provisional. Further west, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Roman site of Italica offers another example of architectural uncertainty. Founded in the 2nd century BCE and later expanded under Emperor Hadrian, Italica features an amphitheater, residential quarters, and public buildings. Among these is a structure known as the Traianeum, believed to be a temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Trajan. While the identification of the Traianeum is supported by inscriptions and its prominent location, certain aspects of its layout have prompted further inquiry. The surrounding porticoed courtyard and adjacent rooms suggest that the complex may have served additional functions beyond religious worship. Some historians propose that it may have also functioned as a civic center, hosting gatherings or administrative activities. Others argue that its design reflects a purely ceremonial space, intended to reinforce imperial ideology. The dual possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Roman architecture often accommodated multiple functions within a single complex. However, the lack of detailed records specific to this site leaves room for differing interpretations regarding the primary role of the structure. In Gaul, modern-day France, the site of Glanum presents a particularly layered example of cultural and architectural transition. Originally a settlement of the Saljes, a Celtic Ligurian people, Glanum was later incorporated into the Roman Empire. The site includes temples, baths, and residential areas, reflecting both pre-Roman and Roman influences. Among its structures is a building often referred to as the valetudinarium, or hospital. This identification is based on its layout, which includes a central courtyard surrounded by small rooms. While similar arrangements have been associated with medical facilities in Roman military contexts, the evidence at Glanum is not conclusive. No medical instruments or inscriptions have been definitively linked to the site. As a result, some scholars question whether the building truly served as a hospital. Alternative interpretations suggest it may have been a guest house, administrative center, or even a private residence adapted for communal use. The uncertainty highlights the challenges of applying standardized labels to structures in regions where local practices may have differed from those documented in more central parts of the empire. In North Africa, the city of Leptis Magna provides further insight into the diversity of Roman provincial architecture. Once a thriving port city, Leptis Magna contains extensive ruins, including a forum, basilica, and market. Among these is a structure known as the Chalcidicum, a term used in Roman architecture to describe a type of entrance hall or portico. The identification of the Chalcidicum at Leptis Magna is based on its position and architectural features. However, its exact function within the urban layout remains a topic of discussion. Some historians suggest it served as a transitional space between commercial and civic areas, facilitating movement and interaction. Others propose it may have had a more specialized role, possibly related to judicial or administrative processes. The ambiguity arises from the limited number of comparable structures and the lack of detailed textual references. While the term Chalcidicum appears in ancient sources, its application to specific buildings is not always clear. This complicates efforts to assign precise functions to surviving examples. Returning to the Italian peninsula, the site of Hadrian's Villa offers a unique perspective on imperial architecture. Constructed in the 2nd century CE as a retreat for Emperor Hadrian, the villa complex spans a vast area and includes a wide variety of buildings, gardens, and water features. Many of these structures are well understood in terms of their general purpose. However, others remain more enigmatic. One such example is the structure known as the Maritime Theatre. Despite its name, it is not a theatre in the conventional sense. Instead, it consists of a circular island surrounded by a moat, with a colonnaded ring and access via movable bridges. The central island contains a small residence, complete with living quarters and amenities. The purpose of this arrangement is not definitively known. Some scholars interpret it as a private retreat within the larger villa, offering isolation and tranquility. Others suggest it may have had symbolic significance, reflecting philosophical or aesthetic ideals associated with Hadrian's reign. The design is highly unusual, and no direct parallels exist in other Roman sites, making interpretation particularly challenging. Elsewhere in the empire, along the northern frontier in Britain, the remains of Vindolanda provide a wealth of archaeological data, including preserved wooden tablets that offer insight into daily life. Yet even here, where written records are more abundant than at many sites, certain structures remain difficult to interpret. Within the fort complex, archaeologists have identified buildings whose layouts do not correspond clearly to known categories such as barracks, granaries, or headquarters. Some of these structures feature irregular room arrangements and lack the standard features associated with military architecture. While they may have served specialized functions, the absence of explicit references in the tablets leaves their roles uncertain. Historians have proposed various possibilities, including workshops, storage facilities, or spaces for administrative tasks. However, without definitive evidence, these remain hypotheses. The situation at Vindolanda illustrates that even in well-documented contexts, not all aspects of Roman infrastructure can be fully explained. In the eastern provinces, the site of Duriaropos offers another compelling case. This frontier city, abandoned in the 3rd century CE, has yielded remarkably well-preserved structures, including one of the earliest known Christian house churches and a synagogue with extensive wall paintings. Among these discoveries is a building identified as a possible Mithraeum, a temple associated with the cult of Mithras. While the identification is supported by certain architectural features and iconographic elements, the interpretation is not universally accepted. Some scholars argue that the evidence is insufficient to confirm the building's function as a Mithraeum. Others suggest it may have served a different religious or communal purpose, possibly adapted over time. The broader context of Duriaropos, with its diverse religious landscape, complicates efforts to assign clear labels to individual structures. The coexistence of multiple traditions within a single urban environment suggests a degree of flexibility in how spaces were used and understood. Across these varied sites, the recurring theme is one of interpretive complexity. Roman architecture, while often standardized in form and function, also allowed for adaptation and innovation. In provincial contexts, this flexibility was influenced by local traditions, available materials, and specific administrative or cultural needs. The absence of definitive explanations for certain ruins does not indicate a lack of understanding, but rather reflects the limits of current evidence. Archaeologists continue to refine their methods, incorporating technologies such as ground-penetrating radar, digital reconstruction, and material analysis to gain deeper insights into these structures. At the same time, historical interpretation remains grounded in careful analysis and scholarly debate. Multiple hypotheses may coexist, each supported by different lines of evidence. The goal is not to impose certainty where it cannot be justified, but to present a balanced view that acknowledges both what is known and what remains open to question. These unexplained or partially understood ruins serve as reminders of the complexity of the Roman world. They challenge assumptions, encourage further investigation, and highlight the dynamic nature of historical inquiry. As research continues, some of these questions may find clearer answers, while others may persist, contributing to an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present. In many regions once governed by Rome, the survival of architectural remains depends not only on their original construction but also on patterns of abandonment, reuse, and environmental change. Over centuries, buildings were repurposed, dismantled, or buried, often altering or obscuring their original functions. As a result, archaeologists frequently encounter structures whose current form reflects multiple phases of use, complicating efforts to reconstruct their initial purpose. In the city of Ostia Antica, Rome's principal port during the imperial period, this process is particularly evident. Ostia contains a dense concentration of warehouses, apartment blocks, temples, and commercial spaces. Among these is a structure known as the Cassagiato del Serapide, traditionally identified as a sanctuary dedicated to the Egyptian god Serapis. The identification is based primarily on a statue base and associated iconography found within the building. However, the broader layout of the structure includes features typical of commercial spaces, such as storage rooms and access points suitable for goods transport. This has led some scholars to suggest that the building may have functioned as a mixed-use facility, combining religious and commercial activities. Such dual-purpose structures are not uncommon in Roman urban environments, where economic and religious life often intersected. Nevertheless, the precise balance between these functions at the Cassagiato del Serapide remains uncertain. The available evidence allows for multiple interpretations, each supported by different aspects of the site's physical and material record. Further north, in the Roman province of Germania Superior, the site of Saalburg provides insight into military architecture along the empire's frontiers. Reconstructed in the early 20th century based on archaeological findings, Saalburg represents a typical Roman fort. Yet even within this relatively standardized context, certain features remain difficult to explain. One such feature is a series of small, isolated buildings located just outside the main fortifications. These structures do not conform to the typical layout of civilian settlements, known as vici, which usually developed adjacent to forts. Their size and construction suggest temporary or specialized use, but their exact function is not clearly documented. Some historians propose that these buildings may have served as workshops or storage facilities supporting military operations. Others suggest they could have had administrative or logistical roles, possibly related to supply distribution. The lack of inscriptions or distinctive artifacts limits the ability to confirm any single interpretation, leaving their purpose open to discussion. In the eastern Mediterranean, the site of Gerasa offers a well-preserved example of a Roman provincial city. Its colonnaded streets, theatres, and temples reflect a high degree of urban planning. Among its many structures is a building referred to as the South Tetrapylon, a monumental gateway located at a major intersection. While tetrapyla, four-sided gateways, are known from other Roman cities, the specific function of the South Tetrapylon at Gerasa is not entirely clear. Its elaborate design and prominent location suggest a ceremonial or symbolic role, possibly marking a transition between different urban zones. However, there is limited evidence to indicate whether it also served practical purposes, such as traffic control or administrative oversight. Some scholars argue that such structures were primarily decorative, intended to enhance the visual coherence of the city and reflect imperial influence. Others suggest they may have had more specific functions related to processions or civic rituals. The absence of detailed textual references means that these interpretations remain tentative. In Asia Minor, the site of Azenoi contains a number of unusual features that have attracted scholarly attention. Among them is a large macellum, or market building, which includes an inscription referencing a system of price controls associated with the Edict of Diocletian in the early 4th century CE. This provides valuable evidence for economic regulation in the late Roman Empire. Adjacent to the macellum is a circular structure whose function is less clearly understood. Its design does not correspond directly to known building types such as temples, baths, or theatres. Some researchers have suggested it may have served as a meeting place for merchants or a space for administrative activities with market regulation. Others propose it could have had a ceremonial function, possibly linked to civic identity or local traditions. The proximity of this structure to the macellum suggests a connection, but the nature of that relationship is not definitively established. As with many such sites, interpretation relies on spatial analysis and comparison with better documented examples, rather than direct evidence. In the western provinces, the Roman city of Augusta Raurica presents another instance of architectural ambiguity. Excavations have revealed a building known as the scola, characterized by a large hall surrounded by smaller rooms. The term scola in Roman contexts can refer to a meeting place for guilds or associations, but its application to this specific structure is not universally accepted. The layout suggests a communal function, possibly with professional or social groups. However, the absence of inscriptions identifying a specific organization leaves the interpretation open. Some historians have proposed that the building may have served as a training or administrative center, while others suggest it could have had a more informal role as a gathering space. The uncertainty is compounded by the fact that similar structures in other parts of the empire have been interpreted in different ways,
depending on local context and available evidence. This variability highlights the challenges of applying generalized categories to individual sites. Returning to Italy, the ancient city of Herculaneum offers a unique archaeological record due to its preservation under volcanic material following the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. While many buildings have been identified with a high degree of confidence, some spaces within the city remain difficult to interpret. One example is a series of rooms located near the waterfront, initially thought to be boat storage facilities. Subsequent excavations revealed human remains within these spaces, suggesting they may have been used as shelters during the eruption. However, the original function of the rooms prior to this remains uncertain. Some scholars argue that they may have served as storage areas for maritime, given their proximity to the harbor. Others suggest they could have been with industrial activities, such as fish processing or goods distribution. The reinterpretation of these spaces over time demonstrates how new evidence can reshape understanding, while still leaving certain questions unresolved. In the Balkans, the site of Felix Romuliana, a palace complex commissioned by Emperor Galerius in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE, presents another case of architectural complexity. The site includes fortified walls, temples, and residential buildings. Among these is a structure often referred to as a mausoleum, believed to be associated with the imperial family. While this identification is supported by certain features, including its location and design, the absence of definitive burial evidence has led some historians to question the interpretation. Alternative theories suggest that the building may have served a ceremonial or commemorative function without necessarily containing a tomb. The broader layout of Felix Romuliana, with its combination of defensive and ceremonial elements, reflects the changing nature of imperial architecture during this period. Yet the specific roles of individual structures within the complex are not always clear, particularly in the absence of detailed written records. Across these examples, it becomes evident that the interpretation of Roman ruins is shaped by a combination of evidence and context. Buildings rarely exist in isolation. Their meaning is derived from their relationship to surrounding structures, their placement within the landscape, and the material culture associated with them. At the same time, the limits of the archaeological record must be acknowledged. Organic materials decay, inscriptions are lost, and later can alter or obscure earlier phases of use. As a result, even well-preserved sites may contain elements that resist definitive explanation. Scholars approach these challenges through a range of methods, including comparative analysis, experimental reconstruction, and interdisciplinary collaboration. Advances in technology, such as 3D modeling and chemical analysis, have expanded the range of available data. However, interpretation remains a process of careful reasoning rather than absolute certainty. The ruins discussed here do not represent failures of understanding, but rather opportunities for continued inquiry. They illustrate the diversity of Roman architecture and the adaptability of its forms across different regions and contexts. In doing so, they also highlight the importance of maintaining a balanced perspective, one that recognizes both the achievements of Roman engineering and the complexities inherent in reconstructing the past. As research continues, these sites will likely yield further insights, refining existing interpretations or introducing new possibilities. Until then, they remain as enduring features of the historical landscape, inviting observation, analysis, and thoughtful consideration. As archaeological research continues to expand across former Roman territories, attention has increasingly turned towards sites that do not conform easily to established categories of Roman architecture. These structures, often preserved in partial or altered states, raise questions not only about their function but also about the broader assumptions used to interpret the Roman-built environment. In many cases, the challenge lies not in the absence of data, but in the complexity and ambiguity of the evidence itself. In the region of Campania, near the Bay of Naples, the ancient town of Cumae contains a structure traditionally identified as the Antro della Sibilla, or the Cave of the Sibyl. This long, trapezoidal corridor carved into volcanic rock has been associated since antiquity with the Cumaean Sibyl, a prophetic figure mentioned in Roman literature, including the works of Virgil. The identification of this structure as a prophetic chamber, however, remains debated. While its design, featuring a long passage with side openings, suggests a controlled and possibly ceremonial environment, there is no direct archaeological evidence linking it definitively to oracular practices. Some historians argue that the corridor may have served a defensive or military function, possibly as part of a larger fortification system. Others suggest it could have been a passage with water management or storage. The association with the Sibyl may reflect later interpretive traditions rather than original usage. This illustrates a broader issue in archaeology, where literary sources can influence the identification of physical remains, sometimes leading to conclusions that are difficult to substantiate through material evidence alone. Further inland, in central Italy, the site of Alba Fusens offers a well-preserved example of a Roman colony established in a strategically important location. Among its ruins is a structure known as the Macellum, typically understood as a marketplace for food, particularly meat and fish. However, the building at Alba Fusens deviates from the standard layout associated with Macella in other Roman cities. While it includes a central courtyard and surrounding rooms, its proportions and internal arrangements differ from more clearly identified examples. This has led some scholars to question whether the structure functioned solely as a market. Alternative interpretations suggest it may have combined commercial activities with administrative or social functions, possibly serving as a gathering place for local or civic interaction. The ambiguity is compounded by the lack of inscriptions or related artifacts that would confirm its role. As a result, the designation of the building as a Macellum remains tentative, reflecting a broader pattern in which architectural labels are applied based on partial similarities rather than definitive evidence.
In the eastern provinces, the city of Apamea presents another example of interpretive complexity. Known for its extensive colonnaded street and large public buildings, Apamea was a significant urban center during the Roman period. Among its ruins is a structure often referred to as the Great Theatre Baths, a complex that appears to combine elements of both bathing facilities and performance spaces. The integration of these functions within a single structure is unusual, and scholars have proposed various explanations. Some suggest that the complex may have evolved over time, with different sections serving distinct purposes at different periods. Others argue that the design reflects a unique local adaptation, possibly influenced by regional architectural traditions. The available evidence, including the arrangement of rooms and water systems, supports the presence of bathing. However, the proximity to the theatre and the presence of large open areas raise questions about whether the space may have also been used for gatherings or performances. Without clear documentation, the precise relationship between these remains uncertain. In North Africa, the Roman city of Sabratha contains a number of well-preserved monuments, including a theatre, temples, and public baths. Among these is a structure known as the Temple of Liber Pater, dedicated to a deity associated with fertility and wine. While the temple itself is clearly identified through inscriptions, an adjacent building has proven more difficult to interpret. This neighboring structure includes a series of rooms arranged around a central courtyard, with features that suggest both domestic and ritual use. Some historians propose that it may have functioned as a residence for priests or temple. Others suggest it could have been used for ceremonial preparations or communal activities with religious festivals. The lack of definitive artifacts linking the building to a specific function leaves these interpretations open. The proximity to the temple implies a connection, but the nature of that connection is not fully understood. This highlights the challenge of interpreting ancillary structures within larger religious complexes, where multiple activities may have taken place simultaneously or sequentially. In the western provinces, the site of Lugdunum, once the capital of Roman Gaul, offers further examples of architectural ambiguity. Among its remains is a structure referred to as the Odeon Annex, located near the city's theatre and Odeon. While the primary performance spaces are well understood, the function of this adjacent building is less clear. The layout suggests a series of that may have served administrative, storage, or preparatory purposes. Some scholars argue that it could have been used by performers or officials involved in theatrical productions. Others propose that it may have had a more general civic function, possibly related to gatherings or meetings. The absence of inscriptions or distinctive features makes it difficult to assign a specific role. As with many such structures, interpretation on contextual analysis and comparison with similar sites, rather than direct evidence. Returning to the Italian peninsula, the site of Paestum, originally a Greek colony later incorporated into the Roman world, contains a number of temples and public buildings. Among these is a structure known as the Comitium, traditionally identified as a space for political assembly. However, the identification of this building as a comitium is not universally accepted. While its circular form and central location are consistent with known examples, the absence of clear markers or inscriptions leaves room for alternative interpretations. Some historians suggest it may have served a judicial or administrative function, possibly as a venue for local governance. Others argue that the structure may have had a ceremonial role, possibly with civic rituals or public announcements. The uncertainty reflects the broader challenge of interpreting civic architecture in contexts where documentation is limited and architectural forms may have been adapted to local needs. In the northern reaches of the empire, along the Danube frontier, the site of Carnuntum provides a well-preserved example of a Roman military and civilian settlement. Among its many structures is a building referred to as the Heidentor, or Heathen's Gate, a monumental arch-like structure standing in isolation. Despite its imposing appearance, the original function of the Heidentor is not definitively known. Some scholars interpret it as a triumphal monument, possibly commemorating a military victory or imperial visit. Others suggest it may have served as a boundary marker or symbolic gateway, its location outside the main urban. The structure's design does not correspond exactly to typical Roman arches, and its isolated raises questions about its intended role. Without inscriptions or associated features, its purpose remains a subject of scholarly debate. Across these diverse sites, the recurring theme is the interplay between evidence and interpretation. Roman architecture, while often guided by standardized principles, was also shaped by local conditions, historical developments, and evolving social practices. As a result, not all structures can be easily categorized within existing frameworks. The process of archaeological interpretation involves weighing multiple lines of evidence, including architectural form, spatial context, material remains, and comparative analysis. In cases where these elements do not converge on a single conclusion, scholars must present competing hypotheses, each grounded in available data. These unexplained or partially understood ruins do not diminish the achievements of Roman engineering or urban planning. Rather, they enrich the historical record by highlighting its complexity. They remind us that the Roman world was not monolithic, but diverse and adaptive, with regional variations that continue to challenge modern understanding. As research progresses, new discoveries and methodologies may shed further light on these structures. Until then, they remain integral to the study of antiquity, inviting careful examination, encouraging scholarly dialogue, and reflecting the enduring depth of the Roman past. In the final consideration of these sites, the broader significance of unexplained Roman ruins becomes increasingly apparent. They are not anomalies in isolation, but rather part of a wider pattern that reflects the diversity, adaptability, and regional variation of Roman architecture across centuries. As the empire expanded, it absorbed existing traditions, responded to environmental constraints, and adapted its building practices to meet local needs. In doing so, it produced a built environment that was both recognizable in its core principles and varied in its execution. This complexity is evident in the city of Pompeii, where extensive excavation has revealed a remarkably detailed picture of urban life prior to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Despite the high level of preservation, certain structures within the city remain difficult to interpret with certainty. Among them is a building known as the House of the Surgeon, one of the oldest domus in Pompeii. While its layout is generally consistent with elite residential architecture, the presence of numerous surgical instruments found within the structure has led to differing interpretations. Some scholars argue that the house functioned as both a residence and of medical practice. Others suggest that the instruments may have been stored there temporarily, or that the occupant had a secondary profession unrelated to the primary function of the building. The uncertainty highlights a key challenge in archaeology. The relationship between artifacts and architectural space is not always straightforward. Objects can be moved, reused, or deposited in ways that do not reflect their original context. As a result, caution is required when drawing conclusions about the function of a structure based solely on its contents. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the site of Caesarea Maritima provides another example of interpretive complexity. Built by Herod the Great and later integrated into the Roman administrative system, Caesarea features a harbor, aqueducts, and public buildings. Among these is a structure identified as a warehouse complex, located the harbor. While its proximity to maritime infrastructure supports this interpretation, certain of the building, such as internal and architectural, suggest that it may have served additional functions. Some historians propose that parts of the complex may have been used for administrative purposes, possibly with customs or taxation. Others suggest that it may have included residential or commercial spaces, reflecting the multifunctional nature of port. The lack of inscriptions or detailed records leaves these possibilities open. The structure's role within the broader economic system of Caesarea remains a topic of scholarly discussion, illustrating how even well-preserved sites can contain elements that resist definitive classification. In Asia Minor, the city of Perge offers further insight into the challenges of interpreting Roman ruins. Among its many structures is a large rectangular building located near the main colonnaded street, often referred to as the palestra. Traditionally associated with athletic training, palestri are typically connected to bath complexes and include open courtyards surrounded by colonnades. However, the building at Perge lacks some of the features commonly associated with palestri, such as clear access to bathing facilities. This has led some scholars to question its identification. Alternative interpretations suggest that it may have functioned as a civic gathering space, a school, or even a market. The ambiguity arises from the building's hybrid characteristics, which do not align fully with any single known category. Such cases underscore the importance of context in archaeological interpretation. Without clear parallels or supporting evidence, even well-preserved structures can remain difficult to classify. In the Western Mediterranean, the Roman city of Empúries, established on the site of an earlier Greek settlement, presents another example of architectural uncertainty. Excavations have revealed a building known as the Roman Basilica, typically understood as a space for legal and administrative activities. However, certain aspects of its layout differ from more clearly identified basilicas elsewhere in the Roman world. The proportions of the hall, the arrangement of spaces, and the absence of specific architectural markers have led some historians to question whether the building functioned exclusively as a basilica. Alternative interpretations suggest it may have combined judicial, commercial, and social functions, reflecting a more flexible use of public space in this particular context. The debate illustrates how standard architectural labels may not always capture the full range of activities associated with a given structure. Roman buildings were often multifunctional, and their use could evolve over time in response to changing needs. Further north, in the province of Britannia, the site of Fishbourne Roman Palace provides one of the most extensive examples of a Roman residential complex in Britain. Built in the 1st century CE, the palace includes elaborate mosaics, gardens, and bath facilities. While its general function as a high-status residence is well established, certain of the complex remain difficult to interpret. Among these are a series of rooms whose layout does not correspond clearly to known domestic functions. Some scholars suggest they may have served as administrative spaces, possibly related to the governance of the surrounding region. Others propose that they could have been used for ceremonial purposes or as guest accommodations. The lack of evidence leaves these interpretations open. The situation at Fishbourne reflects a broader pattern in elite Roman architecture, where the boundaries between private, administrative, and ceremonial spaces were often fluid. This fluidity can complicate efforts to assign specific functions to individual rooms or, in the Balkans, The site of Diocletian's palace offers a final example of architectural ambiguity. Constructed in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE as a retirement residence for Emperor Diocletian, the palace combines elements of a military camp, imperial villa, and urban center. Over time, it was adapted into a living city, with later structures built within its walls. Within the original complex, certain areas, particularly in the southern and eastern sections, do not have clearly defined functions. Some historians interpret these spaces as service areas, possibly used by staff or for storage. Others suggest they may have had ceremonial or administrative roles, particularly given their proximity to more formal sections of the palace. The continuous occupation and modification of the site over centuries have further complicated interpretation. Layers of and have obscured original features, making it difficult to reconstruct the palace's initial layout with complete certainty. Across all these sites, a consistent theme emerges: the limits of certainty in historical reconstruction. Roman ruins, even when well preserved, do not always provide clear answers. Their interpretation depends on a careful balance of evidence, context, and scholarly reasoning. Where definitive conclusions cannot be reached, multiple hypotheses must be considered, each evaluated on its merits. This process is not a weakness of historical study, but a reflection of its rigor. By acknowledging uncertainty, historians and archaeologists maintain the integrity of their interpretations. They avoid imposing modern assumptions on ancient contexts and remain open to new evidence that may alter existing understandings. The unexplained ruins of the Roman world serve as important reminders of this approach. They demonstrate that even in a civilization as extensively studied as Rome, there remain aspects that are not fully understood. These gaps in knowledge do not diminish the achievements of Roman engineering or governance. Instead, they highlight the complexity of a society that spanned vast geographical and cultural boundaries. As new technologies continue to enhance archaeological investigation, through remote sensing, digital modeling, and advanced material analysis, it is likely that some of these questions will be revisited with fresh perspectives. Yet it is equally likely that certain aspects will remain unresolved, not due to a lack of effort, but because the available evidence does not permit definitive answers. In this way, the study of Roman ruins is an ongoing dialogue between the present and the past. Each structure, whether clearly understood or not, contributes to a broader understanding of how the Roman world functioned, adapted, and endured. The ruins themselves, shaped by time yet grounded in historical reality, continue to invite careful observation and thoughtful interpretation. They stand not as puzzles to be solved definitively, but as enduring records of human activity, complex, layered, and, in some cases, still open to question.